Well, they destroyed the offices of the stamp tax collectors. They destroyed the offices of stamp tax collectors. Destroyed the offices of stamp tax collectors. In protest, they burned stamps in the streets. In protest, they burned stamps in the streets. So what do you think they did? They went into those offices of the stamp tax collectors and they took the stamps that had not been used yet, right? And they burned them in the streets. They also destroyed houses of royal officials. Royal official or British officials that were living in the colonies, they destroyed their homes. Destroyed the homes of royal or British officials living in the colonies. And if they found any citizens, number 5, that were sympathetic to Great Britain, what did they do to them? If they sought out people that were loyal to Great Britain and supported this stamp tax in Great Britain, and what did they do to them?
Killed.
They tarred and feathered them. Yes, Mason, totally redeeming himself. Attaboy. They tarred and feathered them. I can't imagine. You hear about it, but can you really imagine being covered with tar and then throwing feathers on you? That would be horrible. I can't imagine the mess that would take. So they tarred and feathered citizens that were sympathetic to Great Britain. They were battling for their rights. So what does all this action lead to? No, our next subtopic. Repeal of the Stamp Act. Repeal of the Stamp Act. Repeal means you take it away. Now, King George III was kind of surprised and kind of taken back by all this protest, and he said, quote, "It is undoubtedly the most serious matter that has ever came before Parliament." Okay? So when King George III heard about all this protesting, he said, quote, "It is undoubtedly the most serious matter that ever came before Parliament." So he's realizing they got a problem, that Parliament has never had to deal with the backlash that they've had to deal with on this Stamp Act. Now, of all the things that were done, what turned the tide the most to repeal the Stamp Act? All the things we talked about, they did under opposition. The non-importation agreements was the number one thing. Okay, British merchants were just shocked, and that basically brought American-British trade to a standstill, and British merchants faced financial ruin. They were going down the crapper. I mean, they were not losing money like you couldn't believe. They were going bankrupt, losing their businesses, because who was their biggest trader? American colonies. So when the colonies said, hey, we're not going to trade with you anymore, British merchants were shocked. These non-importation agreements brought American-British trade to a standstill. Many British merchants faced financial ruin. And so they went to Parliament and said, hey, you got to repeal this act. We're just getting killed here. Okay? So that was the biggest part. They didn't like all the other things going on. You know, they didn't like what the Sons of Liberty were doing, but they sure were concerned about no trade. And so basically these British merchants went to Parliament and said, man, we've got to do something here. We're just getting killed financially. Now, just so you know, there were some British leaders that sided with the colonists and actually joined for the repeal of the Stamp Act. There were some British leaders that could see what the colonists' point was. And one of those British leaders over in Great Britain that got it was Edmund Burke. He was a British leader and also a very famous writer. And Edmund Burke stated publicly that he was proud of the colonists who fought against these illegal measures, such as the Stamp Act. So there were British leaders who could see through to what the colonists were trying to say and accomplish. And one of those British leaders that sided with the colonists was Edmund Burke. He was a British leader and a writer, and he expressed his pride in the colonists for fighting against what he considered illegal measures. Okay, so there were people in Britain that said, hey, this isn't right. So, after heavy pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1766. So under heavy pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1766. So under heavy pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1766. And obviously, the colonists were rejoiced. The British merchants were rejoiced because they were going to be able to trade again. And any friends of the colonists were pretty happy too. The Sons of Liberty were so excited that in New York City they erected a huge flagpole called the Liberty Pole and gathered around it to celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. So the Sons of Liberty were pretty excited in New York City. They put up a new huge flagpole in New York City, called it the Liberty Pole, and they gathered around it to celebrate. Parliament just didn't quite get it, because in the excitement of the repeal of the Stamp Act, the colonists weren't paying too much attention, and I'll be darned if Parliament didn't pass another law called the Declaratory Act of 1766, shortly after they repealed the Stamp Act of 1765. So as the colonists were celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act, they weren't paying much attention to another law that was passed by Parliament. This law was called the Declaratory Act of 1766. And I want you to write down, I'm going to give you a quote of what it says, and I want you to think about what it means. So while the colonists were all excited about the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act of 1766. And this was it said that Parliament, this is what it stated, Parliament had, quote, full power and authority. The Declaratory Act of 1766 stated that Parliament had, quote, full power and authority to make laws, full power and authority to make laws, to bind the colonies, full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America, full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people in America in all cases whatsoever. In all cases whatsoever. So the Declaratory Act of 1766 stated that Parliament, quote, had the full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. What does that state, Talon? What's the Declaratory Act state?
They can do whatever they want.
They can do whatever they want, no matter what, anytime they want. Now, I just don't think that was a good law to pass right after this, okay? Now, that takes us to another very controversial act called the Townshend Acts. That's your next subtopic, the Townshend Acts. And we'll get a little start on this, and then we'll move into a very familiar term that you're aware of, and that's the Boston Massacre. I bet you've all heard of that. So the Townshend Acts. Well, in 1767, the British Parliament moved away from George Grenville, right? And the man that took over was Charles Townshend. Charles Townshend. Charlie Townshend? Is that what you're thinking? Not spelled the same, but... So, in 1767, Parliament takes a different turn. They go away from George Grenville, and they appoint Charles Townshend to the Prime Minister, and his job is the same as Grenville's, to raise revenue in America. Now, they were a little bit smarter, sort of. They decided, they said, you know, these colonists are used to indirect taxes. They didn't complain about indirect taxes, in which the tax was placed only on things that were purchased and sometimes included in the price. So we're going to go away from the direct tax philosophy of the Stamp Act, and we're going to return to the long accepted method of collecting taxes in America indirectly. Okay? So what they're doing is, instead of putting a tax on something and collecting it for the government, they're going to put a tax on things that people would purchase. Okay? Now, these taxes would be levied as import duties on articles of everyday use in America that came into colonial seaports. So they're going to tax things that come into colonial seaports that people buy, kind of like we talked about before, indirect tax, and normally that tax is thrown on what? Part of the purchase price. So they're thinking, well, since the colonists don't mind indirect taxes, and they're used to paying those, let's just get away from the direct tax, makes it sound worse, and we'll go back to collecting indirect taxes instead, and then they won't complain. That was Townsend's idea. Didn't think it would cause any trouble. So, here are the type of things that the Townsend Acts levied import duties on. Items of everyday use. So, they're going to tax these as they bring them in. You know, kind of in a way like a sales tax to a point. But these people, okay, we've been used to doing that. So, here's the things they're going to tax that are imported in. Tea, lead, glass, colors for paint, like when you go down and you're going to paint your bedroom, they fix up your paint with all these different colors so it matches what you want. So those are some examples, but basically anything that was imported in that people would buy. So Courtney's going to bring her big ship over from Britain, and I'm the merchant, and I'm going to buy all these things from her, and she's going to sell me these, but she's going to tax me on these things that I purchased, whether it's included in the price, which is going to be a little higher than I'm used to, or you're just going to say you're going to pay 4% tax, okay? Then Courtney's going to buy that stuff, and then she's going to sell it to colonial people and do the same thing to get their tax to make a profit, okay? Now, really, if you think about it, the colonists probably would have accepted these new taxes. They probably wouldn't have complained, but Parliament had to go one step further and pass an additional law that made them mad. So they really, in essence, if you think historically, they probably would have accepted these indirect taxes, as I mentioned, that came in on imports. They probably would have done that. But what happened is Parliament went a step farther and they passed a law known as the Writs of Assistance, or Rights of Assistance. Does anybody know what a right of assistance is, or writ of assistance? It doesn't make sense to what it is by looking at it, but what is a writ of assistance? In essence, it's a search warrant. So Parliament passes new laws known as the Writs of Assistance. And basically they're search warrants. Because what are they worried about, again, with these indirect taxes coming in? Smuggling. No different than before. So these writs of assistance or search warrants were written statements that gave government officials the legal right, to search for smuggled goods, just like they had done before. So they could search the colonial businesses, they could search colonial ships, they could search even a colonist's home if they wanted to, just like before. Now what's the difference between a search warrant? We'll end with this. What's the difference between a search warrant today and a search warrant in 1766? What's the difference between the two search warrants? What? Okay, Nick's got a good point. You have to get one from a judge. They had the legal authority. They didn't have to find a judge because it was a law. But what's the difference between if a police officer gets a search warrant to search your car? They have to have probable cause, but they're looking for what? A specific thing. Yeah, they're a specific thing. So if this would never happen, but if the police thought Hannah had marijuana in her car, they would get a search warrant, and stated in the search warrant would be they're looking for marijuana. So if they found guns in her car, what would they do? What would happen then? That'd be a little shaky, because what are they looking for? Marijuana. in colonial writs of assistance or search warrants, they could go in there and look for anything they wanted. Okay, so if they went in there and found out they were doing something they shouldn't have been, that didn't have anything to do with smuggling, could they be acted upon? Yeah, so the big difference is this. Today's search warrant, a search warrant must state the exact article that is sought and the specific place to be searched. Okay? In colonial times, a British customs official could enter any vessel, any warehouse, any home at any time, ransack the entire place in the hopes of finding smuggled goods. A search warrant today, you can't do that. Okay? Now, if you get a search warrant to search for drugs in a person's house, can you ransack the house? Well, you can if it says the house. If it said we're going to look in the guy's garage, if the search warrant was for drugs in the garage, could they go into the house and ransack the house? No. Okay? That's the difference. So these were a little bit a violation of rights as well. So obviously, colonists are going to express resentment about the Townshend Acts. And the problem is they really didn't get too fired up about the Townshend Acts as much as they did the writs of assistance. If they would have just left things alone and if the British Parliament would have just said, you know, we're going to tax this stuff, but they got all wound up about this smuggling, and as a result they passed these search warrant laws, and it caused some problems. So we're going to talk about those tomorrow. We're going to continue to talk about the Townshend Acts, and we'll get into the Boston Massacre. Now, if you want to spend the rest of the period as little as it is to work on your assignments, you can. Otherwise, those are due at the start of the period tomorrow.